Hello, my name is Christopher Renstrom. I'm the creator of rulingplanets.com and Christopher Renstrom Astrology. And this week, I want to share with you a very special episode where we will be talking about the astrology of Sailor Moon. Before we do, I wanted to ask you, what was your first encounter with astrology? Where did you first come across astrology in your life? Was it someone asking you what your sign was? Was it pulling a book off the bookshelf of a bookstore and looking up your sign? Was it in a newspaper column or a fashion magazine? Perhaps it was a blog or some sort of social app. But I want you to think about where you first encountered astrology. I first encountered astrology when I was a little kid. I remember that my mom was really into astrology, but she wasn't into astrology in a sort of hardcore sense. She was just curious about it. And she would bring home things like, oh, I remember an astrology coloring book, and there was a gorgeous astrology jigsaw puzzle. There was an astrology game with a dice that I couldn't make heads or tails of. But then there was also this wonderful book, and I think it was published in about 1967, so I'm dating myself here. It was called The Coffee Table Book of Astrology. And I remember she would come home and she would plop the book down and start to make dinner for me and my brothers. And she would be like, while I'm making dinner, why don't you go ahead and look up everybody's sign? Let's start with your father. He's a Scorpio. And so I would read aloud from the book, and we would be like, wow, that fits, or no, that doesn't fit. Or we would laugh uproariously or get rather dramatically silent as we thought about what it really meant. But these were wonderful times, and it was a wonderful way to engage astrology. Many of us engage astrology for the first time through popular culture. In fact, popular culture is responsible for astrology still being around. A lot of times we might think, because astrology is this ancient art form, this ancient science, that one must go and study ancient sacred texts in order to understand astrology, but no, you don't have to. And the reason for that is because astrology has never stopped being astrology. Yes, there's an extraordinary library of ancient texts. There's an astrological tradition where techniques and interpretations have been handed down through the centuries. But that's not what caught the imagination of the layman. What caught the imagination of the layman was seeing astrological symbols on the ceilings of synagogues or on the edifices of churches. Astrology, with its zodiacal symbolism, was carried down through illuminated manuscripts, through prayer books, through decorative objects. Astrology was passed down through its almanacs and then eventually periodicals and 19th century women's magazines until it made its great leap into the popular culture, especially here in America, in the 20th century. That's when astrology appeared in movie magazines. It appeared in its own magazines that you could buy off the newsstands. It was syndicated in newspapers, and it was available for anyone to go and read. They could go and read their sun sign and look it up and sort of laugh and say, that has nothing to do with me. Or they'd be like, oh, this is really intriguing. Let me read about my husband. One of the main reasons, if not perhaps the main reason, why astrology never became a fossil science, why astrology never retreated into obscurity. One famous example of this is Sailor Moon. Sailor Moon was created by Naoko Takeuchi, and it was serialized in a monthly magazine in Japan that ran from December 28th, 1991 until February 3rd, 1997. Sailor Moon began as what is called a manga, which is a sort of hybrid of a magazine and a comic book. And it featured a young girl who was able to transform herself into a superheroine by the name of Sailor Moon. That is how Sailor Moon began. Sailor Moon became a very popular manga and eventually an anime, which is a Japanese cartoon which was distributed throughout Asia, and then it made its way to Europe, South America, America, Canada, Australia. It spread out all over the place. Sailor Moon became an extraordinary phenomenon. So Sailor Moon was distributed through manga, it was distributed through anime, there were musicals, there was cosplay, there were fans, and then there was this extraordinary line of toys and merchandise. Sailor Moon was originally targeted for, let's say, an audience of 13 to 18-year-old girls. But because the toys were so cute and they were so popular, it was kind of repurposed for younger kids. Although the themes of the Sailor Moon manga are very, very mature. But as I said before, Sailor Moon was more than just a story about a superheroine. This is where a lot of 13 to 18-year-old girls got their first exposure to astrology. Each of the sailors who were schoolmates were able to channel through themselves the powers of each of the planets in astrology. And it's this extraordinary marriage of Eastern and Western astrology that makes Takeuchi's Sailor Moon such an extraordinary phenomenon. Sailor Moon, before she transforms herself into Sailor Moon, is in reality a 14-year-old Japanese schoolgirl. She introduces herself as, "I'm Usagi Tsukino. I'm 14 years old and in my second year of middle school. My hobbies are eating, sleeping, and slacking off. And I have to admit, I'm kind of a crybaby." Now, one can immediately recognize in just the opening description of Usagi, she's born under the zodiac sign of Cancer. And this is what's so wonderful about the manga. She immediately is showing off all the Cancerian characteristics. She's asleep, she's always hungry, she's late for school, she doesn't really want to go to school. If she goes to school, she actually shows up for school. That is, if she hasn't wandered off in search of something more interesting to do. She's behind on her assignments. When she gets hungry, she wants to eat immediately. So she usually has her lunch at about maybe 10 in the morning before lunchtime. Usagi is not exactly the role model of a superheroine. What she is a typical depiction of a Japanese schoolgirl. What's exported as the popular image are these kind of like, study machines, girls who cram their heads full of information and facts and really excel. But Usagi is more along the lines of a typical schoolgirl. She's not particularly remarkable. She's not particularly gifted or skillful or much interested in anything other than another bite to eat and going back to sleep if she can. Yet Usagi's name is in itself a pun. Usagi means rabbit in Japanese, and Tsukino means of the moon, so that her whole name means rabbit of the moon. And what this references is an old Japanese folktale. One night, the man on the moon came down to earth disguised as a beggar, and he came upon a fox, a monkey, and a rabbit, and he asked them for some food. Well, the fox went right away to a brook, and he fished out a fish and gave it to the man. The monkey leapt up into the trees and gave him some fruit that it had collected. The rabbit, knowing that all it did was eat grass, realized that a human being was not going to want to eat grass. And in the fire that the man on the moon had begun to build, the rabbit immediately threw itself into the fire in order to roast itself. Well, the man on the moon was shocked by this rabbit throwing itself into the fire to roast itself, to offer itself up as a meal to this man on the moon disguised as a beggar. And the man on the moon immediately, reached into the fire and grabbed the rabbit out, and it was burned and in pain. And through the miracle of restoration, the man on the moon was able to restore the rabbit to its prior form. And so, all refreshed and brought back to life and in all one piece again, the man on the moon asked this rabbit, "Why did you do such a thing?" And the rabbit explained to him, "Well, you don't eat grass and you needed something to eat, so I knew that you would eat rabbit." And the man on the moon, so deeply impressed by the rabbit's self-sacrifice, by its willingness to kill itself, to roast itself in order to feed the man on the moon, immediately decided to immortalize him. To honor the rabbit's kindness, the man on the moon took the rabbit back to the moon to live with him forever. Now, if you look at this picture of the full moon, you can see the outline of the rabbit pounding mochi on the moon. Mochi is a popular snack of mashed sticky rice that's been around for centuries in Japan. Originally used at religious ceremonies and as an offering to the gods, mochi is nowadays a typical snack. One day, late for school, again, Usagi is rushing down the street to school and she steps on a black cat. And the black cat immediately goes, and Usagi's like, oh no, I'm sorry, and she races off to school. And she doesn't really think anything of it until that night. That night, she's asleep in her bed. She's left her window open because it's a warm evening. And the black cat reappears in the window. And it has on its head a silver crescent moon. And it's staring at Usagi. And Usagi wakes up and she sees the black cat and admires the crescent moon on its forehead, and the black cat begins to talk to her. Now, this is a manga, so the idea of animals talking to people is nothing out of the ordinary. It's rather typical. But what this black cat communicates to Usagi is basically, I want you to take this brooch, and Usagi is immediately like, oh, what a beautiful brooch. It's so gorgeous, thank you. And the black cat says, well, it's not just for you to wear, it's for you to transform. And Usagi's like, transform into what? And the black cat says, I want you to say, moon power, make up. And Usagi's like, you've got to be kidding. And the cat's like, I want you to say, moon power, make up. So Usagi's like, all right, moon power, make up. And immediately Usagi is transformed into Sailor Moon. And Sailor Moon, as you see, has long flowing blonde hair. She has her hair buns done up to resemble a rabbit. She carries a moon wand with a crescent moon at the top of it. And she's dressed in a sort of transformed sailor outfit. Japanese schoolgirls wear sailor outfits typically for middle school. And Sailor Moon's uniform is basically transformed into this super heroine outfit. And she finds herself immediately transformed into this. And she immediately goes off to fight a crime, to rescue, actually, it's a schoolmate from an evil demon. She hears the cries for help, and she goes rushing off to rescue her schoolmate. All of this automatically and without thinking. Now, when Usagi is Sailor Moon, she's much more intelligent. She's a lot quicker on the uptake. She's very alert and ready to go and rescue a schoolmate. Okay, this is what she does. And she goes to fight this demon that's trying to suck the life out of her schoolmate. Sailor Moon is full of all sorts of demons or these entropic entities that are sucking the light or the energy out of people. It's the opposite of light, if you think about it. And Sailor Moon isn't particularly gifted, or she doesn't really know what to do. And she kind of waves the wand, the demon throws things at her and she's like, ouch, she hasn't turned into Wonder Woman or something like this. She's not trained for this. And so her cat is with her to coach her and to tell her what to do and to take out the brooch. I think she shines the brooch and the demon turns into nothingness and she's saved her friend. And she transforms back into Usagi, who's just completely bewildered. Did I just see what I saw? Did I just do what I did? And she turns to the cat and she's like, what just happened, cat? And the cat says, my name is Luna. And Usagi is like, oh, okay, excuse me, I'm sorry, but what just happened? And Luna says, you have a very important mission. And Usagi's like, I have a mission. And Luna says, you need to assemble your teammates so that you can find the princess. And the key to finding the princess is the silver crystal. And Luna's like, don't worry, I'll be right here beside you the whole time. And we will go find your teammates and rescue the princess and get the silver crystal, because that's what all of these evil villains are after. And Usagi's like, evil villains are after a silver crystal. I don't know if I can deal with this. Now, what's fascinating about what's going on here is that the theme of the moon is always being introduced in new and different ways by the creator Takeuchi. We know that the moon is the queen of the night and that the moon is associated to dreams and sleep. And so what we have right here at this point is literally a sleeper agent. Usagi doesn't know this, but she is a sleeper agent. Now, the word sleeper agent comes from the idea of a sleeper, and that can be someone asleep, but a sleeper is also an unremarkable person that suddenly gains prominence. So it could be like, for instance, a sleeper hit. Like this movie was made and no one knew that it was going to be a sleeper hit. It comes as a great surprise. The term sleeper agent is this idea that a spy is sent by one country into another country where the spy lives a normal, typical life. But a sleeper agent was made popular by the film made in the early 1960s called The Manchurian Candidate. And The Manchurian Candidate, if you have a chance to see it, is really, really wonderful. It stars Frank Sinatra and Angela Lansbury as the evil mother of the sleeper agent, who I think is played by the British actor Lawrence Harvey. Lawrence Harvey was one of a number of soldiers who were brainwashed in a foreign country. And he's been given a signal that if he ever sees, I think it's the Queen of Diamonds, he will suddenly remember that he has this mission to assassinate the President of the United States. So it was this idea that there were spies who weren't aware that they were spies, that there were foreign agents who weren't aware that they were foreign agents. They were actually American soldiers who had been brainwashed, and he's one. And so if he ever sees the Queen of Spades, that's when suddenly his eyes go into a fog and he picks up a rifle and tries to assassinate the president. That's the plot of the movie. And so what we see here is this idea of sleeper agents. Usagi Tsukino is a typical 14-year-old girl, but when she says moon power make up, all of a sudden she remembers her mission. Her mission is that she is a sailor soldier. She doesn't really know the origin and the background of this yet, but she is a sailor soldier and her mission is to find her princess. And the key to finding her princess is to locate the silver crystal. So this is something that Usagi now knows she needs to do, but Usagi also knows that she's harboring inside of her an entity that is superpowered and that is greater than she is. And so her mission, as it's just been imparted to all of us by Luna, is to go and find the other sleeper agents. In any case, Usagi is not the only one looking for the mystical silver crystal. There's the evil Queen Beryl and her demons who are looking for this. And there is also a fellow by the name of Tuxedo Mask. Tuxedo Mask is a young superhero. He was styled after Lupin, the gentleman thief, who was a famous 1905 character, famous for wooing ladies while stealing their jewelry at night. So Usagi, of course, being a 14-year-old girl, falls in love with Tuxedo Mask on first sight. Tuxedo Mask is an archetype that you often find in Japanese manga targeted at teenage girls. In the manga, the teenage girl is always like 14. She's young, she's innocent, she's sweet, she's very romantic, and all she wants is a boyfriend. She wants to fall in love. And usually the teenage girl will fall in love with an older boy, a few years older than herself, who's more worldly, who's more sophisticated. There's a bit of an air of indifference to him, and there's also a bit of a bad boy streak. Tuxedo Mask being based on Lupin, the gentleman thief. Lupin was famous for stealing into the bedrooms of women in the middle of the night to take their jewelry. And the women, even though they were being robbed, didn't really seem to mind because it was Lupin. All right, but within the character of Tuxedo Mask, he wears a tuxedo, he's a gentleman, and he's always chaste in the way that he treats Sailor Moon. So this is their first encounter. They're both looking for the mystical silver crystal. Tuxedo Mask's name, he has a regular name, is Mamoru Chiba. And once again, Takeuchi uses the name to hint at the character underneath. So Mamoru Chiba comes from the Japanese Chiba Mamoru, which means protector of the earthly place or protector of the earthly plane. And his powers are psychometry and healing. powers that are associated to the sun. And indeed, Tuxedo Mask's birthday is August 3rd. He's Leo. So psychometry is the ability to touch an object and to immediately read the energy of the object. You could read the history of the object, who last touched it. Or if it's a possession that belongs to someone, you can read that person's character, their background, their history. You can even read that person's future or where they are. It's the perfect talent to have for someone who's seeking a mystical silver crystal, because he can touch different crystals and he can tell for certain whether it's the real thing or whether it's a fake. The silver crystal, in Japanese, its name is Maburoshi no Ginsuisho. And Maburoshi no Ginsuisho is translated as the phantom silver crystal. Maburoshi can mean something that has no substance, but looks like it does. So Maburoshi stands for the idea of something that's illusory or ephemeral. It's legendary, it's mythical, it's something that maybe people made up, but there's still something very compelling about it. There's something that people, I swear, that it really exists. Now, silver, because it's the mystical silver crystal, silver is naturally associated with the moon. It's the mineral, it's the metal of the moon. So what they are looking for is a crystal that is ephemeral, it's illusory, but it's silver, it's associated to the moon, and this is its connection to Sailor Moon. Now, just to return to this comic book panel really quick, which is the first time that Tuxedo Mask and Sailor Moon meet, he says, "My name is Tuxedo Mask. Sailor Moon, I'll remember that." And of course, she responds with, "He's just like Lupin, the gentleman thief." What I wanted to point out here is something which is really wonderful. It's a terrific device that the manga uses because it's comic book form. And so whenever someone refers to Sailor Moon, what you will see down there in the word balloon is a crescent moon with a star above it. So this is the symbol, this is the sign of Sailor Moon. It often appears when people call out Sailor Moon in the manga. This is juxtaposed with when Usagi speaks, her word balloons, you'll see like little rabbits, and remember that Usagi's name it means rabbit. So when she's Usagi, you always see like a little rabbit. And when it's Sailor Moon, you'll see this crescent moon and a star. I know it's just a little detail, and I'm probably being a bit of a geek about that, but I just love how in the manga form, you can read these symbols. And this is what really makes reading the manga, if you can read the manga, and it is available in the United States in English, it's a great delight to go and read this because it's a story commenting on the story. And it's really quite ingenious the way that she employs this device. The next thing that I want to speak about very quickly here is declarations. Whenever Sailor Moon or any of the sailor soldiers go into battle, they declare who they are. Now, this comes from a samurai tradition in Japan, where honor in battle was expressed through announcing one's family name and or lineage before engaging in fight. Okay, so there was no subterfuge, there was no trickery, there was no fooling the enemy. What you did is that you stood right there in front of your enemy and you declared who you are. And one was expected in battle to conduct yourself like a legendary character or a legendary hero. And this was popular in the Kamakura period, which lasted from 1185 until 1333. So here we see Luna saying, "You will lead your team of 4, and together you will defeat the enemy. You will find the mystical silver crystal and the moon princess, and you will keep them safe." And Sailor Moon says, "Moon power, make up." And after she transforms, she usually will say something like, "I am the pretty guardian who fights for love and justice. I am Sailor Moon, and in the name of the moon, I'll punish you." Okay, so this is the declaration of who she is and her intent. And the expectation is whatever villain or opponent that they're facing is going to respond with their background and their declaration. And after they do, then they're then free to engage in battle. Now, let me take a moment here to talk to you about Japanese astrology. Japanese astrology, in and of itself, is a composite. It's a composite of Indian, Chinese, and Near East astrology. That is Hellenistic astrology, which has its origin in Iran. So all of these astrologies mixed together with Taoism to create a form of astrology that was practiced in Japan, which is pretty much known as Japanese astrology. Now, Japanese astrology was practiced by a lineage of Buddhist astrologer monks that emerged in the late 10th century. Chinese astrology, which has a very strong influence on Japanese astrology, Chinese astrology is much older. Chinese astrology appears in the late Zhou dynasty between 1046 and 256 BCE. That's when it appears and it becomes a mainstay. It's practiced during that period of time. Now, there's a big difference between Chinese astrology and the astrology that we practice here in the West. The astrology that we practice here in the West, we have 12 zodiac signs. They're along the ecliptic. The sun passes in front of each one of these constellations. That's how we know that we've gone from being in the season of Gemini into being in the season of Cancer. And the planets pass along that same ecliptic. And that's basically the model for Western astrology. Eastern astrology, that's not the setup, particularly in Chinese astrology. Let me say, in Chinese astrology, that is not the setup. In Chinese astrology, there is the North Pole, the Big Dipper. That's the point of reference. And Chinese astrology uses the star groups and the constellations that circle around the North Pole. And so from them is divided the sky, and those sky divisions descend around our globe so that there is a connection between life here on Earth and the pole star, the Big Dipper star, the pole star. And so that was basically how the sky was set up in Chinese astrology. Now, in Western astrology, as the planets move through each one of the zodiac signs, and again, the zodiac signs do not appear in Chinese astrology at all, but as a planet moves from sign to sign, it will change its element. Like, let's, for instance, say Mercury is in the zodiac sign of Gemini. We know that Mercury is in an air sign, and so it's going to be particularly cerebral, talkative, and very interactive and social. But when Mercury goes into Cancer, which is a water sign, this is going to emphasize more of the water element in Mercury. It's going to be much more emotional in terms of emotional intelligence. There's a real emotional intelligence with Mercury in Cancer because it's a water sign. Also, Mercury in Cancer has a very powerful interior life and a very powerful memory. Memory is associated to the moon, which is the planet that rules the zodiac sign of Cancer. Memory plays a very strong role with people who have Mercury in Cancer. And people with Mercury in Cancer are pretty well known for, if they're ever troubled by something, falling asleep. This is the famous planetary placement in Cancer, which is associated with water. All of this is to illustrate, as a planet moves from sign to sign in Western astrology, it changes its elemental makeup. It changes its elemental expression. Let's return back to Chinese astrology. This is not what happens. Each of the planets in Chinese astrology symbolizes an element, and that element never changes. So the planet itself is the element. So in Chinese astrology, we have 5 elements as opposed to the 4 elements in Western astrology. And 2 of these 5 elements have nothing to do with Western astrology. So in Chinese astrology, the planet Mercury is associated with the element water. The planet Mars is associated with the element of fire. That makes sense. We're able to go, okay, like Mars, fire, that makes sense. But Jupiter in Chinese astrology is associated with the element of wood. Okay, we don't have an element of wood in Western astrology. Venus is associated with metal, the element metal. We don't have an element for metal in Western astrology, but in Chinese astrology, they have metal. Venus is associated with metal. And finally, Saturn. Saturn is associated with the element of earth. Now, Mercury is a water star in Chinese astrology. So in Taoist thought, water is associated with intelligence, wisdom, flexibility, softness, and pliancy. Now, the first sleeper agent that Usagi discovers happens to be a schoolmate, and her name is Ami Mizuno. Now, Ami Mizuno doesn't really socialize much. Her IQ is 300, she's absolutely brilliant, and what she does all day is take tests. She wants to be a doctor one day, just like her mother, and she comes from a very well-to-do family, so there isn't really a lot of common ground for Usagi or Ami Mizuno to meet. And in fact, they meet when Sailor Moon comes to Ami's rescue. Ami Mizuno is having the life and intelligence sapped out of her by some sort of vampiric test CD disc or something like that. Anyway, in that moment when Ami is freaked out, she's panicking, Luna throws her a pen or something like that, and Ami catches it and tells Ami to say, "Mercury power, make up." And Ami's like, "Mercury power, make up." And she transforms into Sailor Mercury. So Sailor Mercury is the first sleeper agent that Usagi discovers. And of course, she has incredible brilliance and all sorts of other abilities as well. And so this is the only one who's really a friend of Usagi's at school. And it makes perfect sense when you think of the moon and Mercury. Both moon and Mercury were associated with the mind, and both planets were associated to messages. Now, in Western astrology, we're used to Mercury being the herald of the gods. And so Mercury is named after the Roman god of communication, the Roman god of the herald. And so we think of Mercury in terms of messaging and communication. Now, the best way to think of Mercury in a modern context is as a text message. Okay, your phone buzzes, you look at the phone and you're like, oh, someone's calling me, or someone's telling me this information, right? So this is Mercury in a modern sense. It's instant information that's communicated over a social media device. You can see Mercury, all of that. This was Mercury's association with messaging and with the mind, messages that are recognized and read. The moon was associated to what we now call the unconscious mind, the sleeping mind, the mind at sleep. And the reason the moon was associated to messages in ancient astrology is the moon was associated to dreams, messages that come to you in your dreams. So Mercury is connected to messages that are communicated directly to you, and the moon is connected to nighttime messages, messages of a dream, and they involve symbolism and you trying to sort of decode or figure out what that message meant. So this is really what connects the two of them to one another. But what's also really interesting is the etymology of Ami Mizuno's name. Ami Mizuno comes from the Japanese Mizu no Ami, which means the water's second beauty. Now, we all know that Mercury is a planet, but Mercury is also a chemical element. The chemical element Mercury is a shiny metallic liquid. It's the only metal to exist in liquid form at room temperature, unlike, gold, silver, tin, copper, etc. Its chemical symbol is Hg, and it's derived from the Greek word hydragyrum. Now, that comes from the words hydor, which is water, and argyros, which is silver. Remember, silver is connected to the moon. And the meaning of those words is liquid silver or quicksilver, something that's always been associated to the speed and the acceleration of Mercury. And of course, Sailor Mercury's declaration is, "I am the pretty guardian who fights for love and intelligence. I am Sailor Mercury. Douse yourself in water and repent." The next Sailor Guardian we meet is Rei Hino. Her name comes from the Japanese Hino Rei, which means the spirit of fire. She's not a classmate of Usagi and Ami's. She is instead a Shinto priestess, which sounds really quite noble, but actually what it means is that she attends the Shinto temple. Now, Rei is attended by two crows. Their names are Phobos and Deimos because they're named after the moons of Mars. So you can already see how Takeuchi is introducing Sailor Mars just through these motifs. Now, as I said before, Rei is a Shinto priestess. It sounds very special. Well, what's interesting is Takeuchi, for a time, was a Shinto priestess, which basically means that you cleaned up the Shinto temple. And maybe you would attend certain rituals, like maybe a wedding ritual or something like that, and wave some garlands or leaves or something like that. She didn't really have much to say about it. I mean, I think she was expecting something more occult, more glamorous, but Rei comes out of her experience as a Shinto temple priestess. Now, Shinto means the way of the gods. It's indigenous to Japan, and it predates all historical records. Shinto's many practices, attitudes, and institutions revolve around the Japanese land and seasons and their relation with human inhabitants. So Rei is really the sailor guardian who's the most connected to Japan as a country and also to Japan as a nation. Rei is a rather unemotional girl. She's actually pretty soldierly, meaning stoic in her manner. She has a very wry sense of humor, and she can be very cutting in her exchanges. But there's a very solid camaraderie that she has with the other girls. She's very serious. She has a sixth sense. And what also makes her stand out from the other girls is that she doesn't get all girly when it comes to boys. In fact, she finds boys annoying, if not completely beneath her. So Rei pretty much keeps her own company, except when it comes to the Sailor Guardians. She has an ability to read the future, and her weapons are the ofuda, which are Shinto talismans, which she can light with fire and she throws at the enemy. It's kind of like hex bolts in a way. So Rei really, in her guise as Sailor Mars, is more of a shaman than she is a soldier. Later on in the series, she wields a fiery arrow, but early on, she throws these talismans and she can basically cast spells against the enemies. Now, when Rei powers up into Sailor Mars, her declaration is, I am the pretty guardian who fights for love and for passion. I am Sailor Mars, and in the name of Mars, I'll chastise you. Now, just a quick note here, but there was an earlier version that appeared in the earlier manga, where Rei's declaration was, I am the pretty guardian who fights for love and for passion. I am Sailor Mars, and in my chic high heels, I chastise you. I'm sorry, I just love that one, and I just had to share it with you. Now, the next guardian that we meet is Sailor Jupiter. Her name is Makoto Kino, and she's a transfer student. Now, Makoto immediately stands out from the other girls at the school. She's much taller than the girls her age, and she's built bigger than the other girls her age. In fact, she looks like a field hockey goalie, all right? And one of the first things that she does, or how she meets Usagi is distracted by something and she's crossing the street. She's not looking where she's going. And Makoto grabs her, and rescues her in the last moment before being hit by a car. And what's fun about that is that you already see the protective nature of Jupiter coming through her, that she is the guardian of all the guardians. Makoto, of course, also brings her own lunch to school. She's an expert chef. And so this is her association with bounty and generosity. So when she transforms into Sailor Jupiter, there's thunder and lightning, and she appears in this wonderful white and green sailor uniform. The green is there because of its association with the element of wood. So we get the Western understanding of Jupiter by Makoto being the largest of all the girls. Jupiter is the sky god of thunder and lightning, so Sailor Jupiter will have thunder powers. So we get the Jupiter component of Makoto in that she's larger than the other girls. And Jupiter in Western astrology is a sky god, so it's associated with thunder and lightning. Sailor Jupiter indeed has thunder powers, But Makoto Kino, the etymology of the name Makoto Kino, comes from the Japanese Kino Makoto, which means the tree's truth. And this is where we start to get into the wood element that is connected to Jupiter. The Japanese name for the planet Jupiter is Makusei, which means wood star. And as a result, Sailor Jupiter has plant-based powers. Lightning and thunder belong to wood, and Jupiter's sacred tree in both Greek and Roman mythology is the oak. Now, this is something that I find really interesting. Actually, this is something that I find really exciting. In Western astrology, one of the key words for Jupiter is expansion. Okay, it's not a word I'm really thrilled about because what does it say other than expanding waistlines and associating that with Jupiter? But I think it's meant to denote the idea that expansion meaning making bigger, making something bigger. And maybe that has something to do with Jupiter being the largest, the biggest planet in the solar system. But what's fascinating is that when you bring in the element of wood being connected to Jupiter, wood grows, okay? If you water a plant, if you water a tree, over a period of time, it grows, it gets larger, it expands, particularly a tree. It begins to really sort of expand and take over territory. So what I find fascinating about this is that perhaps the idea of expansion comes more from the idea of Jupiter being connected to the element of wood than it does just from being a big planet, which is often the way that Jupiter is referred to in Western astrology. When we go further with this into Taoism, we discover that the attributes of the element of wood, strength and flexibility. So it's strength like an oak, but flexibility like bamboo. So it's wood that can be both strong and flexible. Moreover, the attributes of wood in Taoism are warmth, generosity, cooperation, and idealism. All attributes that we would immediately associate with Jupiter. And so we've got the protective quality of Jupiter, we have the largeness of Jupiter, we have the growth, the association to things growing being connected to Jupiter. So we have a largesse, which is also connected to generosity, warmth, cooperation, and idealism. And as you can imagine, these are all qualities of Makoto Kino. Another thing that Makoto Kino does all the time is that she's always falling in and out of love, just like Jupiter. And she kind of like collects an assortment of boyfriends that you see in one episode and don't appear in another one and are quickly replaced by somebody else. So she has these Jupiterian qualities of falling in and out of love. Makoto Kino's declaration when she transforms into Sailor Jupiter is, I am the pretty guardian who fights for love and for courage. I am Sailor Jupiter. I will fill you with regret that will leave you numb. And finally, we meet the last Sailor Guardian, who fills out the team tasked with the assignment of rescuing the princess and finding the mystical silver crystal. Her name is Minako Aino, which is from the Japanese Aino Utsukushi Koromo, which means love's beautiful child. Her name is Sailor Venus. Now, unlike the other guardians who discover themselves by transforming from their mortal selves into their sailor guardian selves, Sailor Venus has been around for a while. Okay, so she's not discovering herself. If anything, Sailor Venus has been monitoring the awakening of the different guardians. Now, unlike her fellow Sailor Guardians, Sailor Venus is already, I don't know, woke. Okay, she's been in operation for a while. She's very well known. She's actually very famous as Sailor V. And the girls know exactly who she is. They've been following her exploits in the manga, and because she's a real-life superheroine, they've also been following her exploits in the newspapers, where she battles crime and punishes criminals. She's also been making a lot of money. Sailor Venus is very astute. She has franchised herself. She has her own comic book. She has a super popular video game. And she operates out of a control center with a cat She has a cat just like Sailor Moon does, and her cat's name is Artemis. And what they have been doing is that they have been monitoring the different awakenings of the sailors. And now that all of the sailors have been awakened, this is the time that Sailor Venus has chosen to introduce herself. Now, Takeuchi has a very interesting take on Sailor Venus. In Western astrology, Venus, we know Venus as named after the Roman goddess of love. But in Sumerian cosmology, Venus is named after the Sumerian goddess Inanna. And Inanna is indeed the goddess of love, but Inanna is also the goddess of war. And there were two aspects of Inanna. Venus as an evening star was seen as an omen of peace and love. Okay, so Venus as an evening star is more the Venus that we understand, which is the goddess of love and beauty, the goddess of peace. However, Venus as a morning star, that is, she appears before the sun, she appears before sunrise. Evening star is after sunset, morning star is before sunrise. She was seen as a goddess of war. All right. And this is how Takeuchi chooses to depict Sailor Venus. All right. So she is marshaling the forces. She introduces herself to the other Sailor Guardians, and they get all fangirly about it. They're like, oh, Sailor V, that's how they know her from the manga. Sailor V, oh my God, you're Sailor V. We're meeting you for the first time. And so Sailor Venus is like, yes, 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 you're meeting me for the first time. We have to get to work right away. I am the princess that you've been looking for. Okay. And we need to find the mystical silver crystal, or before the evil villains do, or we're all going to be in a lot of trouble. And they're like, oh, all right, princess. Wow, we found the princess. And Usagi is like, yay, we found the princess. This is great. Like we can check this off the to-do list. And so Sailor V is like, yes, I'm the princess that you're looking for. And we're going to go into battle. And you're going to take my direction. And I'm going to lead you into battle with my weapon, the Venus Love Me Chain Whip. Okay, that's my favorite thing. Okay, she has this weapon called the Venus Love Me Chain Whip that she brings out. And what you get there is like the chains of love, like when you fall in love, you're chained to someone, and then you get the whip, that sort of element of love, as well. So Venus is ready to lead them into battle with the Venus Love Me Chain Whip. She is the princess that they've been looking for. They're so excited and they're ready to bring it on. They're ready to fight now. Venus, in this martial aspect, is very much connected to the element of metal. Metal is associated to the planet Venus. Venus is associated to the element of metal in Taoism. And this is what Takeuchi is working with. Now, the attributes of metal are rigidity, persistence, strength, and determination. The metal person can be excessive and controlling, as well as ambitious, forceful, and set in their ways, as metal is very strong. So this makes perfect sense that Sailor Venus sees her as the general. She's leading the other Sailor Guardians into battle, and she has declared herself the princess. She is the princess that they are all looking for. However, there remains still the problem of where is the mystical silver crystal. Sailor Venus has no idea where it is. The other Sailor Guardians have no idea where it is. And the cats, Luna and Artemis, also have no idea where it is. And so Sailor Venus's idea is like, well, let's just go and fight crime and butt until the villains and the villainesses who are looking for the mystical silver crystal show up and maybe they'll show us the way. And they're like, okay, sounds like a plan. And almost on cue, Queen Beryl, who is the queen of the Dark Kingdom, appears. She's been sending knights out to fight every one of the Sailor Guardians. She appears once more and sends her strongest knight to fight them. And there is this terrific, very dramatic battle that takes place in the skies over Tokyo. And in this battle over the skies of Tokyo, the villain in the orb shoots out like a death ray or something like that, and it's aimed right at Sailor Moon. And she's kind of frozen there in a moment. And Tuxedo Mask throws himself in front of her and he takes the hit. He is hit with the full force of this and he falls. Okay. And he falls and Sailor Moon cries out, Endymion. And everyone's like, huh? Who's Endymion? That's Tuxedo Mask. And she cries out, Endymion! Tuxedo Mask begins to fall and downward spiral through the sky, and Sailor Moon rushes and catches him in the sky. And in that instant, an orb of light, like a full moon, appears around the fallen Tuxedo Mask and Sailor Moon, so that the other weapons cannot penetrate it at all. And in that moment, Sailor Moon is transformed yet again. She loses her costume. Her hair extends into these long, beautiful strands of blonde hair, and she appears in this gown. This gown, by the way, is based on the Palladium gown, which was designed by Christian Dior and was the rave. It was all the talk in the 1992 Dior collection, which Takeuchi saw and was completely like, oh my God, that's the most beautiful thing in the world. I'm going to have my princess wear that gown. So Usagi is transformed into the princess. And in that instant, a crescent moon appears on Usagi's forehead, and the symbol of Venus appears on the forehead of Sailor Venus. And we discover that the princess is not Sailor Venus at all, but that the princess is Usagi. What's fascinating is how Takeuchi combines the two lights of the night. In ancient skies, the two brightest lights of the night were the moon, which changed its appearance as it went through its lunar cycle, and Venus, when she would appear either as an evening star or a morning star. What's happened here with the Guardians is that Sailor Venus, without knowing it, was herself a sleeper agent. She had been set up as a decoy so that if the dark forces came looking for the princess, they would come looking for Sailor Venus. Sailor Venus being associated to the element of metal, of jewelry. Jewelry is metal and stones are set on metal, but also weapons are made of metal. So Sailor Venus in her bat cave, her control center, has been fighting crime and has been acting as this kind of like decoy. When Sailor Venus fights crime, she wears a mask and Sailor Moon is unmasked. Now, if you were to look at them, and it often happens when you're reading the manga, they look the same. Both of them have blonde hair, and both of them have long tresses. But Sailor Moon's hair is made up with the rabbit bunny ears, and Sailor Venus just has long flowing hair and maybe a ribbon behind her hair. They both have cats that are associated to the moon. Sailor Moon's cat is Luna, and then Sailor Venus's cat is Artemis. And in the storyline that Takeuchi has shared with us, they are themselves confused. Sailor Moon doesn't think in a million years that she's the princess, and Sailor Venus knows that she's the princess. And so this is the turnaround. This is the great reveal that happens in this battle in the skies over Tokyo. Let's talk a little bit more about the crescent moon and star. When the moon is out at night, you can see the other planets in the sky if they are visible. Okay. When the sun is out, you can't see the other planets. Maybe you can see the moon, but you can't see the other planets. And this is really one of the most beautiful things that Takeuchi does with Sailor Moon. A big criticism in astrology is how patriarchal it is. Two of the planets have feminine identities and the rest of the planets are male. And in Western astrology, it's the sun that dominates the culture of astrology. Whereas in Eastern astrology, like Indian astrology and Chinese astrology, it's the moon. You also see the difference in the calendars. In the West, we have a solar calendar, and in the East, there is a lunar calendar. And so what Takeuchi has done here is that she has replaced male superheroes with female superheroes. But these female superheroes aren't guys dressed as women, okay? They're not like butch and they're not like kicking butt and they're not doing all these things. What I love that Takeuchi does is that they're girly. Okay, these are middle school girls, and Takeuchi does that on purpose. She's not going to turn them into people that they aren't, And what she also wants to bring out in the relationships of these sailor soldiers with one another, these sailor guardians with one another, is their sisterhood and their love and care and compassion for one another by basically making Sailor Moon the most girly of them all. Sailor Moon's heroics aren't defined by her great feats. She has superpowers, but her heroics aren't defined by her great feats. Her heroics are defined by her heart and by her love and by her compassion. She always leads with her heart. She always leads with love, nurturing, and compassion, attributes that are associated with the moon. The moon and Venus are two sides of love. With the moon, you get a maternal love, a motherly love, nurturing the child, okay? Family, hearth, home, and family, almost kind of a tribal love. And the moon in Western astrology is certainly associated to blood ties. But what you have is love and compassion. Sailor Moon's heroics aren't going to be overpowering someone else. She actually goes through bouts where she, is weakened or feels weak. Her heroics are always based on her heroic heart, her deep love and her compassion. So it's not so much these great challenges that she faces as it is predicaments or dilemmas, which challenge love. Okay, these are the things that Sailor Moon faces in the manga. And this is in great contrast to Sailor Venus. Sailor Venus, as I just described, is very martial. And so she's ready to struggle, to beat, to overwhelm, to dominate. The other thing that we don't really see in Sailor Moon is the presence of the sun. The sun is always a shadowed or in the dark figure. Tuxedo Mask is a Leo, but you really only see him at night as Tuxedo Mask. So the sun, men aren't the dominant figures in Sailor Moon, it's women. And it's particularly girls. And this was the appeal to girls who were reading the manga. And so they're shown the two night lights. They're shown the moon and Venus, the crescent moon and the star. And so these come together in the story of Sailor Moon and Sailor Venus. So the crescent moon and star is a conjoined representation of the crescent, the moon, and the star, the planet. And it was used in a variety of historical contexts. It was a prominent symbol of the Ottoman Empire, and that's where it became associated with Islam in the 14th century. In contemporary times, the crescent and the star appears on flags ranging from Turkey and Croatia to Singapore. Crescents and stars are a common feature, however, in Sumerian iconography. The crescent was usually associated with the moon god Sin, also known as Nana, and the star was associated with Ishtar, or Inanna, whom we know as the planet Venus. So the great reveal is that Sailor Venus is not the Princess Serenity, Usagi is. But right now, no one can talk to Usagi because she has created an orb of light, an orb of protection around her and Tuxedo Mask. She is appearing as the princess with the long tresses and this beautiful gown, and she is crying. She's actually screaming hysterically in the nighttime sky over Tokyo, and she is screaming out, "Not again! Not again! Not again! Endymion! Endymion! Not again!" And everyone's like, "What's going on here?" And indeed, we all want to know what's going on here. What's going on is that we're meeting another aspect of the moon, which is past lives. The moon is associated with memory in astrology, and it's memory in our everyday life. Our ability to recollect something is associated to the moon. The moon also rules over things like habits and cravings and needs, and also our emotions. So these are all collected with memory as well. But the moon also rules over past life memories, okay? Or the potential, at least, of being able to access past life memories. Because the moon, in its endless cycle of becoming and unbecoming, of becoming a full moon and then a dark moon, only to begin as a new moon and wax towards a full moon again, the moon carries our history. It carries our history and our memories. It carries our body history because it rules the body. But also, what Takeuchi is using here is we're having a past life regression in real time. Or actually, it's not really a past life regression. We're having a past life realization in real time. So, what we're looking at here is that Tuxedo Mask is the reincarnation of Endymion. And by Tuxedo Mask taking the hit and now lying unconscious, dead or either dying, that this has triggered Usagi to transform herself into Princess Serenity. At the same time, Princess Serenity cries. Okay, she's crying out, but she also sheds a tear, and this tear is a silver crystal. Okay, we do a close up in the manga on the tear, and it reflects light like a silver crystal would. And what we realize is that not only is Usagi Princess Serenity, but Princess Serenity is herself the mystical silver crystal that everyone has been looking for. Now, the etymology of serenity in the name Princess Serenity, it comes from the Greek goddess of the moon, Selene, which when transliterated to Japanese becomes a homophone for serene. And so that's the name Princess Serenity. Now, a millennia ago, Princess Serenity was a 14 or a 15-year-old girl, the same age that Usagi is now, and she lived in a beautiful crystal palace on the face of the moon. And this was known as the Moon Kingdom. And she lived there protected by her sailor guardians, and she lived there with her cat, Luna, and also her mother. And this was a time of peace, and this was a time of great beauty. Princess Serenity would go out for walks, and she would look down on the earth, and on the earth she espied a beautiful, handsome prince named Prince Endymion. And he was the ruler of a kingdom, and he was very noble, and he was very honorable. And she fell in love with him. She would sneak her way off the moon, and she would come down to earth, and she would hide behind trees or maybe even walls, and she would spy on Prince Endymion. And she felt this incredible love in her heart for him. And Endymion, of course, felt that someone was watching him, that someone was looking at him. But instead of being alarmed, he was comforted. He felt an inner serenity. And so he would also go out looking for her, who was looking for him. Well, they eventually find one another and they fall deeply in love. And she gives her heart to him, and he gives his heart to her. And they have this heart bond and they have this soul bond, and they swear eternal and undying love for one another. Now, as you can imagine, this love between Princess Serenity and Endymion was frowned upon. And the reason it was frowned upon is because the people of the moon did not socialize with the people of the earth. The main reason for not socializing with the people of the earth is that they outlived them. People of the moon, because of the mystical silver crystal, could live for centuries. They could live for a millennium. All right. Whereas people of Earth would die very quickly, kind of like if you own a pet. If you own like a cat or a dog, you're used to outliving your dog or cat. So that was basically the perspective here. And so this was really frowned upon. It was kind of taboo. And Princess Serenity's mother is not really happy about it when she finds out. And she forbids Princess Serenity to have anything to do with the Earthman, Prince Endymion. But the Sailor Guardians, being entrusted to the guardianship of Princess Serenity, and themselves being 14 to 15-year-old girls, finding it all romantic, of course, like enable her, they cover for her. They not only cover for her with the queen, but they actually even help her down to the earth and they watch over her as she and Endymion, spend time together. They're kind of like lunar consorts to the princess and to Endymion. What happens, though, is that Queen Beryl, who is the leader of the dark forces, but she wasn't all the time. She actually, an earthling, just like Endymion, she's full of jealousy that Princess Serenity is fallen in love with Endymion and that Endymion is in love with Princess Serenity. The other problem with the mystical silver crystal is that it attracts darkness. The easy way of thinking of that is bugs being drawn to a bug light. They're drawn to the light and they zap. Okay, so this is the idea here that dark forces are attracted to the light, but that also extends itself to the idea that darkness inside people are drawn to the light. And what they're drawn to, particularly with the mystical silver crystal, is jealousy and envy. It's like, I envy you that you have this beauty. I envy you your immortality. I envy you your uniqueness. I want to have your light. Why should you have the light? I want the light. And this is the other reason why people of the moon don't have anything to do with people of the earth. They can't help but attract that envy. They can't help but attract that covetousness. And it sort of drives people of the earth mad in a way. And so what happens is that there is an attack or whatever made on Princess Serenity, and the Guardians come to her defense. And there's this battle that takes place between the armies of the moon and the armies of the earth, which Endymion is trying to stem. He's trying to stop it. He's like, this is ridiculous. We can learn so much from them and things about civilization and love and beauty and living together in harmony. And people of earth, being people of earth, do nothing but covet and want and go to war and battle and destroy and dominate and all these sorts of things. And that's what they're doing here. In this battle, Endymion is killed. Princess Serenity cries out in agony and in despair. She can't believe that he's been killed right in front of her eyes. And so the Sailor Guardians immediately come to her and they want to save her. They want to take her back up to the moon. But what she does instead is that she picks up Endymion's sword and she drives the sword through her chest. She drives the sword through her heart and she falls dead over Prince Endymion's dead body. And of course, all hell breaks loose. I mean, the Earth armies can only do so much damage, but as the Sailor Guardians go back up to the moon, no sooner do they communicate that Princess Serenity is dead, that the dark forces that have been held at bay around the moon, okay, these are dark celestial forces that have hungered for the mystical silver crystal. Well, once Princess Serenity is dead, they attack the moon. And so the Sailor Guardians put up a fight against them, but they are vanquished. They are defeated in battle, and the Moon Kingdom is brought to ruin. The Moon Kingdom collapses, and everything that was life and light and good about the Moon Kingdom is destroyed, and what is left is only ruins. Now, this story of Princess Serenity and Endymion is actually based on a Greek myth about Selene, the goddess of the moon, and Endymion. Now, in some myths, Endymion is a king, and in some myths, Endymion is a lowly shepherd. Selene is a goddess of the moon, and she sort of like, looks over the crescent moon down at the sleeping Endymion, and she falls in love with him. And Endymion is related to Zeus, so she goes to Zeus and she asks for his permission, for the two of them to be lovers, for the two of them to marry. And Zeus says, well, he's a mortal and you're an immortal, and that's going to be a problem. And she's like, well, is there any way that you could sort of make him immortal? And he's like, I can't really make him immortal, but what I can do is I can put him to sleep. I can put him to sleep, and in that sleep, he will never age. He will always be youthful. And Selene is completely enamored by this idea that she can visit Endymion in his sleep, that Endymion basically goes into a coma that he will never awaken from. And Selene can come and visit him in his sleep and in his dreams. And she even says to Zeus, "This is wonderful, because I can watch him sleeping. And when he's sleeping, he doesn't look distressed or worried. When he's sleeping, he looks peaceful and he looks attractive and he looks luminescent. And I like him asleep. He doesn't say anything, he doesn't talk. And this is a wonderful thing." And Selene finds this to be an absolutely wonderful thing. This is such a wonderful arrangement between Selene, the goddess of the moon, and the sleeping Endymion that she comes and visits him in his sleep and winds up having 50 children by him. Okay, that's how wonderful this arrangement is. Okay, so this is the Greek myth that Takeuchi based the story of Princess Serenity and Endymion on. So, like Endymion in Greek mythology, Mamuchan or Tuxedo Mask takes on this passive role with Sailor Moon, and he's always sacrificing himself for her. And it's this sacrifice that Endymion made a millennium ago that Tuxedo Mask repeats in this battle over the skies of Tokyo. It's this sacrifice that not only triggers the transformation into Princess Serenity, but it also reveals the presence of the mystical silver crystal. And this tear that rolls down the cheek of Princess Serenity enters into the body of Tuxedo Mask, and it keeps him from dying. It holds him in this limbo space until they can figure out how to rescue him. So this lunar solar symbolism based on the Selene and Endymion myth also echoes the alchemical concept of the Eros Gomos, which is the marriage of sun and moon with the divine wedding, the divine marriage. And of course, they rescue Tuxedo Mask and they revive him and make him well again so that Mama-chan and Usagi can become boy and girlfriend. Okay, they can't become lovers or man and wife because he's like 19 and she's 14 or 15. Okay, so they save Mamo-chan, they save Tuxedo Mask so that they can become boyfriend and girlfriend, which they become. All right, so everything seems like it's wonderful that they're getting together, that all's well with the world. They've defeated evil forces, Queen Beryl and her dark kingdom, they've defeated them, and everything is all right, and they can go back to their life as schoolgirls in middle school. And they're sitting in a playground, and, he's leaning over for a kiss, and she's leaning over to kiss him back, and their lips are about to meet when all of a sudden, out of the sky falls Chibi Usa. Chibi Usa is a little girl with pink hair who looks a lot like Usagi, and she's fallen out of the sky, and she lands on the two of them in this marvelous moment of interrupting a kiss. I guess we call this kissus interruptus. Okay, and she lands on both of them. And they look up at her. She is basically, says, "Give me the mystical silver crystal." And she actually has a gun with her and she's holding it at them. And Chibi Usa maybe looks like she's 7 or 8. And they're kind of like taken aback, like, "Who are you? What's going on here?" And basically, Chibi Usa comes from Usagi and it means little bunny. And that's her nickname. And she is basically a mini-me version of Sailor Moon, of Usagi. And so she falls down out of the sky and sort of lands on both of them in what I guess we would call kissus interruptus. And Chibi Usa is a girl of about maybe 7 or 8, and she has cotton candy pink hair. And she looks at both of them and she pulls out a gun. Okay, this like 7, 8-year-old pulls out a gun and she says, "Bring me the mystical silver crystal." And they're both like aghast. Well, what becomes revealed eventually in another fantastic twist by Takeuchi is that Chibi Usa is their daughter. Okay, Chibi Usa is Tuxedo Mask's and Usagi's daughter from the 30th century. Okay, and the moon is associated to mothering and motherhood without having a daughter. All right, so Chibi Usa is introduced as the daughter here, and she's on a mission. She's on a mission to bring Tuxedo Mask and Sailor Moon back to the 30th century to rescue her mother, Princess Serenity. So now we're introduced into a time warp thing that's going on. What's fabulous about this is that this then becomes a mother-daughter feud. Takeuchi really gets into exploring the relationship between mother and daughter, between Usagi and Chibi Usa. But the catch here is Usagi isn't the mother yet. Okay. Usagi's only 14, 15. She hasn't grown into a mature woman yet. And so she's meeting her daughter from the 30th century here when she hasn't even kissed Mamoru Chiba yet. And this is when the daughter shows up. So it's a wonderful metaphor for how a child can interrupt and change the dynamics of a relationship, that a relationship changes when a child is introduced. But what Takeuchi also introduces here is an Oedipal triangle. It's this three-way triangle between mother, father, and daughter. And Chibi Usa is definitely playing the daughter card. And she's a little girl, and she's in a world that she doesn't understand. And she's shown up here with a mission, which was to bring them back to the 30th century, but she doesn't really know how to do that. And obviously, she needs room and board and protection and things like that. She doesn't have anything here in this world. Mamoru immediately feels a very protective feeling about her. He offers his apartment where she can stay in the guest room until they can find her parents, because he doesn't know what the mission is yet, and Usagi immediately starts getting jealous. She's like, why are you paying attention to this little brat? Because Chibi Usa shouldn't be hanging out at a guy's apartment. She should be home with her. And she doesn't know how she's going to introduce Chibi Usa to her mother. But immediately her mother is like, oh, look at who you brought home, this little girl. She's so sweet. Let's make her a member of the family. So Chibi Usa has this ability to make people accept that she's a part of their lives and to feel very familial towards her. This effect really impacts people who are connected to Usagi, either by family relations. So she immediately becomes a member of the family accepted by Usagi's brother, father, and mother. But also because Mamoru is the father of her in the 30th century, he feels a natural fatherliness and a protectiveness. And this is not sitting well with the 14-year-old Usagi. She's feeling jealous. She's feeling competitive. The sibling rivalry comes out. She sees Chibi Usa getting away with all sorts of things, the way that her family accepts her and things like that. And she really is furious at Chibi Usa. And again, it's this wonderful reflection of mother-daughter relationships, but it's cast at a time before the mother becomes the mother and the daughter ever showed up because of a time warp. So it's like, how do you figure it out? But it is so much fun to read, and how she plays with it. Now, what we also have here is the manifestation of the Triple Goddess, all right? We have Chibi Usa as the new moon, that's the child moon. We have Princess Serenity as the full moon, the moon in all of her splendor at night. And then we have Sailor Moon. Really, we can equate Sailor Moon to the quarter moons, okay, to the first quarter moon and the last quarter moon. A quarter moon is that midpoint between the new moon and the full moon. And a quarter moon is either waxing, gaining in light, becoming more powerful, or if it's a last quarter moon, it's waning, it's losing its light, it's losing its power. And this is something that we see a lot with Sailor Moon. Sailor Moon has moments where she is waxing in light, she's gaining light, she's becoming more courageous and confident, more powerful. And then we have Sailor Moon when she sort of reverts to her Usagi self, which is waning, losing light, losing confidence, not sure that she can take on this battle. And she begins to even whine a lot. So we kind of like have a waxing moon and a whining moon. And these are kind of both symbolized by, or embodied rather, by Sailor Moon. And so this is where we have the three-headed goddess, Hecate, and we have the triple goddess of being the new moon, the waxing waning moon, and then of course the full moon. Now, the other side of the equation here Usagi sees Chibi Usa as, being a kid who's manipulating people and getting away with it. Chibi Usa, although she's in the form of a little girl, she is a little girl. She looks exactly like a 7 or an 8-year-old little girl. Chibi Usa is in reality, because she is a moon princess, Chibi Usa is in reality 800 years old, right? So even though she's acting the girl, and she has a girl's temperament, her moon age, I guess we say in moon years, Chibi Usa is actually 800 years old. And on the flip side of this, Chibi Usa has a great deal of anxiety and fear of failure. Her mother, Princess Serenity, is someone that she absolutely looks up to, that she worships, that she sees as immaculate, okay, and that she has taken upon herself to travel back in time to meet her mother as a younger age when she was active as Sailor Moon and bring Sailor Moon back to the future, Chibi Usa's plan. But Chibi Usa knows these things, and she's always plagued by deep insecurity and anxiety and even anger. There's a bit of anger with that as well. So where Takeuchi goes with this is the dark moon Lilith. She introduces this in the Black Lady storyline, the Black Moon Lilith storyline. And we're going to now explore a different aspect of the moon and also a different aspect of astrology. Driven by her sense of inadequacy, Chibi Usa is tempted to step over into the dark side. Okay, she's traveling along some sort of space or time continuum, and she's trying to maybe perform a rescue or something. I forget exactly what it is, but Chibi Usa travels through a space-time continuum and she gets lost. She becomes vulnerable to the temptations of dark forces which surround the moon. And Tuxedo Mask has gone off in search of her. He's dad, so he's gone off in search of her. She can't be alone. And the other guardians are involved in fighting some, villain du jour. So Chibi Usa gets lost. She loses her way, and she gets enticed by the dark forces to become the Black Lady. And so she's immediately transformed into a seductive Chibi Usa. Okay, so she's no longer the 7 or 8-year-old looking girl. She's, seductive and has trim and a bosom, and she's ready to seduce. Okay, and so this is how Takeuchi introduces the Dark Moon Lilith storyline. Now, if you're familiar with the Dark Moon Lilith, she comes from an old Hebrew legend or folk tale that God created Adam and Eve tempts Adam with biting from apple from the tree of knowledge, and Adam takes the bite, as does Eve, and God condemns them and sends them out of the garden and makes them mortal. Eve will experience pain in childbirth, and Adam will toil for the rest of their days, and they go from being immortal to mortal. But this wasn't the first time that God created a female companion for Adam. There was someone who came before, Eve. And the person who came before Eve was Lilith. And Lilith was created as an equal to Adam. And it was Lilith's understanding that we were equals in the Garden of Eden. And so Adam gets amorous with her, and they make love, and then they make love again and again. But Lilith doesn't like the way that they're making love. Basically, what it comes down to is Lilith isn't a bottom, all right? Lilith is a top, okay? And she's sick and tired of taking the submissive position in the lovemaking, and she leaves Eden, okay? She's like, I've had it. You're a lousy lover, and I'm going to go out into the world that lives and exists outside of Eden. And so she takes off and she leaves Eden. And then in Jewish folklore, she becomes associated with a demon, okay, with a demon entity. Now, what's kind of fascinating here is, when Adam and Eve eat of the fruit, and they're exiled into the world, they become mortal. But Lilith never becomes mortal. Lilith is immortal, all right? And she's regarded as demonic. The reason she's regarded as demonic, probably part of it is she's immortal. She's not a human. But the other reason that she's regarded as demonic is that she said no to Adam. And by extension, she said no to God. All right. And so she's demonized. All right. But there's another part to the story that goes along with that. And this comes from German folklore. It comes from the medieval period where there were a lot of Jews in what would later become Germany. And in German folklore, it borrows again from older origins. She's known as Lilith, but she's also known as Lilitu. Okay. And she is a demon goddess. But the way that she is demonic and why she's associated with seduction is that she comes to men in their sleep. All right. When they're asleep at night, and she extracts from them their seed. Now, you can probably imagine what that means and what that is referring to. Okay, so Lilith comes to men in the middle of their night, in the middle of their dreams, and she extracts their seed from them, and she holds on to the semen. And from that semen, from that seed that is not properly inserted into the body of the wife, but in this intervention that Lilith performs, where she extracts the seed from men in their dreams, and in the night, she creates demon babies. Okay, and the reason we know about these demon babies in Judaism, it was said that these demon babies would appear at the funeral of the man whose seed Lilith had extracted from his body. When he died at his funeral, these demon babies would appear at the body of the man in his dying moments, and they would be like, "Where is my papa? Where is my papa? Are you my papa?" And the man would be like, "Oh no," that would torment him in the last moments of his life with, "Papa, you are my papa," and there could be tens, hundreds of, who knows, children looking for dad. Okay, so this was all wrapped up in the folklore of Lilith. And some of these elements are borrowed to describe Dark Moon Lilith, which is rebellious and refusing any sort of patriarchal subservience and things along those lines. What I hope you hear also is a dark mirror parallel version of Selene and Endymion, where Selene agrees to Endymion being put to sleep so he'll look beautiful forever and has 50 daughters by him. She comes to him in his sleep. Dark Moon Lilith comes into the sleep of the man, extracts the seed, produces demon babies who are asking where dad is at the end of his life and tormenting him. So we had this setup that Takeuchi has created here. So Chibi Usa as Lilith, Chibi Usa, seduces Tuxedo Mask. Okay, and the manga, this doesn't appear in the anime, which showed up in the United States of America. The anime was kind of repurposed for a younger audience, but the manga was heavily censored in the United States of America, and parts of the anime were as well. Chibi Usa as Dark Moon Lilith seduces Tuxedo Mask, and they kiss. It's full on father and daughter kiss going on here. Okay. And which is really, shocking. Okay. And does she go there? Does Takeuchi go there? She goes there. So she's going into the mythology of it. She's going into the astrology of it. And Chibi Usa, completely succeeds in her seduction of Tuxedo Mask so that he becomes kind of like a minion of hers. And what eventually happens is that they discover this and they exorcise the dark moon spirit out of Chibi Usa. Chibi Usa reverts from Hooters Chibi Usa to child Chibi Usa. A quick note is that, in the picture of the dark moon Lilith, Chibi Usa, where you see her in her seductive outfit, in true fashion, this is based on an Yves Saint Laurent gown that Amato was wearing for his ad Opium, which advertised his fragrance in the 1990s. And Chibi Usa is wearing Yves Saint Laurent. This is what a fashionista Takeuchi was. She believed that that the villains and the villainesses should be beautiful women, and the villains should be incredibly sexy men, and they should be dressed in haute couture. And Princess Serenity, when she makes her transformation, she's dressed in haute couture. And so here we see Dark Moon Lilith in her Yves Saint Laurent So they rescue Chibi Usa and they break the spell that she holds over Tuxedo Mask, who remembers nothing of it. Chibi Usa reverts back to her true form as a 7 or 8-year-old girl. Now, what's fascinating about this is that Sailor Moon is faced with having to make a decision. She was driven crazy with envy and jealousy by the attention that Momo-chan was showing Chibi Usa. And Chibi Usa was working it, all right? And seeing Chibi Usa as the seductress and that Tuxedo Mask was under her spell, and now they've reverted and everything is brought back to normal. But what Sailor Moon, what Usagi also experienced during that time, was there's an incident where she's driven to so much anger towards Chibi Usa that she lifts her hand to strike her, and then she's horrified. She's horrified that I was so angry at this child, at my daughter, that I was ready to strike her. And she, that really kind of like changes things for her. She stops being so blind in her anger at Chibi Usa. But here Chibi Usa is like standing there in a completely shameful moment. I mean, she's been reverted back to a child, things have been made good again, but everyone knows what happened, except for Tuxedo Mask. He was like under a spell. Okay, so everyone knows what happened. In this moment, she's faced with a predicament. What do? Do you pretend that nothing happened? Do you get angry and confront this child? And your boyfriend who doesn't remember what happened, but that's not good enough. You still let it happen. Do you go into that mode? And what's so beautiful about Sailor Moon, and I think the reason why Sailor Moon has such a strong universal appeal, is that she draws from her heart and she draws from her love. She draws from her love for Momo-chan, and she draws from her heart the love that she has for Chibi Usa. She knows that one day she's going to marry and make love to Momo-chan, and they're going to have a child, and it's going to be Chibi Usa. But that's not where they're living right now. That's not their reality right now. But out of that imagination, out of that ability to put herself in that place, she expresses this extraordinary compassion and forgiveness. She's the adult here. But this has a very deep and dramatic impact on Chibi Usa. Now, will Chibi Usa still have jealousy, insecurity, and anxiety? Yes. But in this moment of forgiveness, Chibi Usa changes from being a manipulative little brat into someone who has conscience, and who realizes that her actions have consequences, that they have impact, that they can hurt other people, that they can also hurt herself. And Chibi Usa really makes this kind of like silent vow to now follow in the footsteps of Sailor Moon, to not envy her so much, but to follow in the footsteps of her, and perhaps to not exploit her advantage over Sailor Moon, which is Sailor Moon is still an expression of an adolescent girl, and Chibi Usa knows better. Chibi Usa's visiting her mother as a teenager, and she knows that her mother is really a beautiful and gracious woman and ruler. And so Chibi Usa changes in the way that she acts towards Usagi. This is a beautiful moment, and it's one that I think really resonated a lot with the teen girl audience. And now, at last, we meet the modern planets. This is the storyline that follows the Black Lady. We meet Sailor Uranus and we meet Sailor Neptune. But we don't meet them in the way that we expect to meet them. We meet them in their civilian identities. Sailor Neptune is a very famous concert violinist. She's a child prodigy. Sailor Uranus is a young man with blonde hair who drives race cars and is known for his championship racing. This is how these two Sailor Guardians make their first appearance. So Sailor Uranus's host name, for lack of a better way of putting it, because these Sailor Guardians completely know who they are, so they've taken on a human guise to interact in the human world. Sailor Uranus's host name is Haruka Tenno. That's from the Japanese Tengoku o Haruka, where Tengoku and O are merged into a single word read as Tenno, which means remote sky king or remote heaven king. So this is Sailor Uranus. And if you're familiar with the history of Uranus in astrology, Uranus was the original god that got creation going into motion. And he was overthrown by his son Saturn, who castrated him and separated heaven from earth. So, with the Japanese working out to remote sky king or remote heaven king, this makes a lot of sense for being the alias for Sailor Uranus. In addition, if you're familiar with the history of the planet Uranus, the history of the planet Uranus in astrology, Uranus in an astrological chart was often seen as representing homosexuality, androgyny, bisexuality, the hermaphrodite, gender fluidity. All of these things were associated with the planet Uranus. And what I want you to remember here is that Sailor Moon appears between 1992 and 1997 in Japan. And Japan is a famously patriarchal society. So for Takeuchi to be working with gender fluidity in a teenager's manga in 1992 to 1997 Japan is really saying something. So Sailor Uranus in their host body is male, but when Sailor Uranus transforms into Sailor Uranus is clearly female. This creates a lot of sexual bewilderment with Usagi, who doesn't really know if Sailor Uranus is male or female. And at one point, Sailor Uranus, in his male host form, steals a kiss from Usagi. He's just so dashing and just so sexy. And so Usagi confronts Sailor Uranus by saying, "Are you a man or a woman?" And Sailor Uranus's response is, "Does it matter?" So this is the take that Sailor Moon as a franchise is taking about gender fluidity at this time. The point that I want to make here is that the manga Sailor Moon created a presence for queer identity long before astrology itself did. So Sailor Uranus brandishes a sword. It's a scimitar, which is a short and curved sword in the style of the Middle Eastern sword. And Sailor Uranus possesses powers associated with the wind and the sky, as well as precognition. Sailor Neptune's host name is Mitsuru Kaio, and that is from the Japanese Umi o Mitsuru, where the Japanese character for Umi is read as Kai, after the Japanese name for Neptune, Kaiosi, which uses the same kanji, rising sea king kanji that was borrowed from the Chinese. So Sailor Neptune's powers are ocean-based, they're sea-based. She can hit people with energy with the force of a wave or a typhoon. Her weapons are the mirror and the violin. The mirror is a reflecting weapon, so that if some villain, targets her with a death ray, the death ray hits the mirror and it's reflected back at the villain and it takes them out. And the violin, she begins to play the violin, and this is how she summons up the forces of the ocean and the waves and things like that. And Sailor Neptune proves beyond a doubt the power of a violin sonata can be just as powerful as a typhoon. So Sailor Uranus and Sailor Neptune are lovers. They're lesbian lovers. And as you can imagine, this was censored in the United States. In the United States, they were cousins. But in Japan, they were lovers, which once again testifies to how innovative the Sailor Moon manga was. So Sailor Uranus's declaration is, "Under the protection of the wind planet of the outer solar system, I am the guardian of the skies, Sailor Uranus." And Sailor Neptune's declaration is, "Under the protection of the ocean planet, also of the outer solar system, I am Sailor Neptune," which leaves one modern planet left. And that modern planet, of course, is Sailor Pluto. Sailor Pluto's host name is Setsuna Mayu, and that's from the Japanese Mayu Setsuna, which means, and I love this, momentary hell king, or literally momentary Hades. Sometimes I just love the way that these translate from the Japanese into the English. In any case, Sailor Pluto is the third of the moderns and creates the modern planet triangle. Sailor Pluto's element is darkness, And Sailor Pluto has power over time and space, the movement, the manipulation of time and space. Now, Sailor Pluto's weapon is the garnet rod, and the garnet rod holds the garnet stone, which is her mystical talisman. Now, the garnet, being associated with Sailor Pluto, is due to an elaborate pun regarding her underworld-based powers and mythology. You see, the Japanese name for garnet is pomegranate stone. If you remember the Greek myth of Persephone, pomegranates were the food of the underworld. So when the Sailor Guardians of the outer planets reveal themselves with Sailor Pluto's declaration, which is, and under the protection of the underworld planet, I am Sailor Pluto, they declare, we three are the guardians of the outer planets. It's quite a dramatic moment when the guardians of the three outer planets reveal themselves to the other Sailor Guardians. But let me take a moment here to talk about the weapons of the guardians of the outer planets. These weapons are the orb, the mirror, and the sword. The sword represents valor, the mirror represents wisdom, and the orb represents benevolence. Now, these objects, the sword, mirror, and orb, were regarded as sacred objects, which only the high priests and the Emperor of Japan were allowed to see. They were also used in Shinto ritual. So these sacred objects that are used in Shinto ritual actually come from an old Japanese myth. It's the story of the sun goddess Amaterasu. One day, Amaterasu and her brother, who was a storm god, were visiting. And being brother and sister, they were having one of those sibling moments where Amaterasu's brother was really getting on her nerves and really annoying the hell out of her. So Amaterasu decided that she was going to leave the visit and she was going to retreat to a cave and disappear into the darkness of the cave and take all of the sunlight with her. It's pretty much analogous to when a child getting upset at playing with another child in a sandbox decides that they're going to pick up their toys and go home. So this is exactly what Amaterasu decides to do. She picks up her sunlight and she goes into a cave and she stays in there. And of course, with the sun goddess in a cave, the entire world is plunged into darkness. And so the other gods and goddesses are like, what are we going to do? You know, life is going to stop existing. No one's going to be able to sacrifice to us. And we have to do something. We have to get Amaterasu back out of the cave. And they turn to her brother and they're like, go apologize to her or something like that. And he's like, no, she's a spoiled little goddess. She can go sit in the cave if she wants to. So the gods and goddesses have to sort of think on their feet. They have to come up with a plan. And what they decide to do is that they're going to decorate the branches of the trees outside of the cave where Amaterasu has retreated to. They're going to hang on the branches, almost like Christmas tree ornaments, orbs. Okay, they're going to hang these orbs on the branches. And then what they're also going to do is that they're going to hold a mirror right there at the mouth of the cave, right there at the entrance of the cave. And so they've got everything set up and it's pitch dark. And they call into the cave and they say, Amaterasu, please, come back out. You know, we're sorry that you had bad words with your brother. He was being a jerk. Come back out and share your light and your benevolence with the world. And Amaterasu isn't answering. And they're like, Amaterasu, please come out. You know, we're plunged into darkness and we miss you. Please come back. And she's like, I'm not coming. You can hear it echoing from the cave. I'm not coming out of the cave until my brother apologizes to me. And they're like, please. They turn to the storm god once again and say, please apologize. He's like, I'm not apologizing to her. You know, she's such a spoiled brat or whatever. You know, and they're like, you know, it's so infuriating. So at this moment, one of the goddesses, you know, thinking on her feet is like, oh, look, everyone. And they're like, she's like, oh, look, there's another sun goddess. Yes, another sun goddess. Yes, there's another sun goddess I can see right over there. And she's coming over to us. Hello, Amaterasu. And so they begin to talk about this other Amaterasu, this other sun goddess who has appeared and is bathing the world in golden light and warmth. And isn't this a wonderful thing? And oh, we don't need that old Amaterasu in the cave. Who cares about her? We have a more beautiful Amaterasu.2, who's shown up on the scene. And Amaterasu down in the cave is like, who is that other goddess? And she starts to get disgruntled and annoyed and actually rather angry. So Amaterasu gets up out of the dark of the cave and she comes to the entrance looking around for this other Amaterasu, that the gods and goddesses are celebrating. And the goddess who thought of the idea is like, shh, shh, to all the others, and so she comes to the mouth of the cave, and there her golden light begins to be reflected in the orbs, in all the orbs that have been hung on the branches of the tree, because this was the plan of the gods and the goddesses all along. So she sees these sparkling, shiny objects, and then she comes to the mirror and she sees herself in all of her glory, but she doesn't know that it's her. And she's like, there is another sun goddess that's out here. How dare you? And she sees this other sun goddess and she vows that she's going to stay. And this will be the end of the other sun goddess. And that's when the gods and goddesses take away the mirror and show that she was really looking at her own reflection all along. Now, Amaterasu could be a little bit of a spoiled goddess, but she also has a great sense of humor. So she had a big belly laugh over the whole thing. And so what the gods and goddesses do is that they give her the mirror as a gift, and they unhook one of the orbs from the tree, and they give her that as a gift. And her brother, finally relenting and finally deciding, to apologize and to show that there are no hard feelings, he gives her his sword as a gift to make up for having annoyed the hell out of her and caused this whole crisis to begin with. And this is how the orb and the mirror and the sword became regarded as sacred items in the Shinto ritual of Japan. Now, by carrying these sacred objects, the orb, the mirror, and the sword, Pluto, Neptune, and Uranus become the heralds of a new age. They become the heralds of the Silver Millennium. They are here to mark the approach of the future, and this is why they have come to Earth. Or this is what they're telling the other Sailor Guardians for now. And finally, we are introduced to the last Sailor Guardian. You might have been wondering where she was, okay? Sailor Saturn. Sailor Saturn appears in the series as a girl, just like the other original Sailor Guardians. She has no awareness, no idea that she harbors within her a Sailor Saturn entity. And her name is Hotaru Tomo. That is from the Japanese Tsuchimo Hotaru, where Tsuchi is read as toe. Mo is not a Japanese word, but rather uses the Chinese character for sprouting. Hotaru means firefly, which symbolizes the spirit of the dead in Japanese folklore. So what essentially her name means is the firefly sprouting from the earth. Now, fireflies were associated to passion and love in Japan, but they were also associated as being the altered forms of the souls of the dead, particularly the souls of military soldiers who were killed in battle. So this firefly sprouting from the earth gives Sailor Saturn this dominion over the realm of the dead. Now, Sailor Saturn's story, as you might imagine, is not a happy one. In fact, it plays in stark contrast to the story of Sailor Moon. Usagi is a typical schoolgirl. She slacks off in class, she's always hungry, she falls asleep, and she has a happy home life, and she has lots of friends, and she's really happy and cheerful in her life. Sailor Saturn, or rather the unawakened Sailor Saturn, housed in the body of Hotaru Tomo, her childhood is anything but happy. It's actually a childhood of childhood abuse, where Usagi is loved and welcomed by her family. Hotaru Tomo is raised by a mad scientist father who, while experimenting on his daughter, there was an accidental fire and it scarred and burned her body terribly. So that the father's response to that was to turn her into a transhuman, or basically a cyborg. Hotaru Tomo is made up of human parts and android or mechanical parts. And these operations were very painful. Her father, driven by the curiosity of science, was relentless, treated her daughter worse than a lab rabbit. And as a result, Hotaru Tomo is reclusive. She's very dark. She's very depressed. And she is in constant pain. She's in chronic pain because the android parts were not accepted by the human parts. And so they themselves are in conflict. Her human body is always rejecting the mechanical parts that have been attached to it. It's Chibi Usa who becomes friends with her and becomes a kind of confidant to Hotaru Tomo. And they have this friendship. Now, during this period of time, there's yet another attack from some sort of an entropy-fueled dark force. I think it's Pharaoh 9 or something like that that's ready to take over the world. And so the modern planets come to the rescue of Earth, and the Sailor Guardians combine their forces and powers with the Outer Planet Guardians to try to defeat this dark being, which is really quite apocalyptic. I mean, this is really the most overwhelming of all the enemies they have fought before. And so they're blasting away and things aren't looking good. And in the midst of this battle, Sailor Moon is apparently vanquished, and they're like, no, this can't happen. This can't be happening again, and this gets Sailor Mercury like, well, what do you mean can't be happening again? What are you talking about? And they're like, we were more than just the Sailor Guardians to announce the Neo Silver Millennium. We were actually set up in place centuries ago after the fall of the Moon Kingdom. And we were set up on the outer planets of the solar system to make sure that nothing upset the Moon Kingdom, the ruins of the Moon Kingdom. And we were made aware of your presence with the reappearance of Sailor Moon. And so, Sailor Mercury's like, oh, okay, and they continue with their battle. But what happens here is that with the falling of Sailor Moon, the battle turns south. Okay. It is going against the combined force of the Sailor Guardians, and things are looking horrible. Okay. It's not bad to worse. It's like this is looking like the end of the world. And in that moment where everything is going down the pit, okay, this dark force is really bringing destruction to all of the planet Earth. In that moment, Hotaru Tomo transforms into Sailor Saturn. All right, so Sailor Saturn appears as a little girl, and her weapon is the glaive. So the element for Sailor Saturn is the element of Earth, because that is what has been distressed. That is what is being destroyed, is the Earth. It's crying out in pain. And she is carrying the glaive. Now, the glaive is a type of pole weapon with historical origins in Europe. It is similar to other pole arms, such as the war scythe and the Japanese naginata, which was wielded by the female samurai in pre-modern Japan. So Sailor Saturn makes an appearance, and when Sailor Saturn appears, everyone stops, okay? And she is accompanied with a trail of fireflies behind her, and she is holding this glaive. She actually appears in this almost kind of straight arrow vertical position as she comes out of the dark maw of where all of this destruction is being waged. Sailor Uranus is terrified, absolutely terrified. And Sailor Uranus cries out, Sailor Saturn, the guardian of silence, under the protection of the planet of ruin, she's revived. And the other Sailor Guardians, the ones who aren't the guardians of the outer planets, are completely bewildered. They're like, what do you mean under the protection of the planet of ruin? And Sailor Uranus turns to them and says, okay, we're going to come clean. We're going to tell you the full story. When the Moon Empire fell and when all of you died, Sailor Saturn appeared on the moon. And with one swing of her glaive, she brought about the complete and utter destruction of the Moon Empire. You had all died. There was no one to protect it. And so Sailor Saturn being born under the planet of ruin, saw that this was ruin, this was disaster, and was basically pulling the plug on the moon empire. And so that glaive is a scythe. It represents death. It represents the end of all things. And this is why we were given our guardian tasks. We were meant to guard against her making a reappearance. Basically, what we are standing here and witnessing is the end of your world, and we have got to stop it. And they're like, but how are we going to stop it? And Sailor Uranus is like, I don't know. Sailor Saturn is more powerful than all of us combined. And so Sailor Saturn stands there hovering in space, her hands on the glaive on the scythe, looking at them. And she says rather wryly, once again, it looks like I am the uninvited guest. And so the moderns immediately begin to, power up all of their power, and they're going to circle around and they're going to blast her out of the sky, or at least try to blast her out of the sky. And Sailor Saturn says, the fact that so many powerful entities have gathered here and that everything has started down the path to ruin was all determined by fate. Now that I have awakened, I must let fall my silence glaive. And with that, she takes a swipe with the glaive. And in this illustration, if you can see it, there's a trail of fireflies that follow this kind of delicate, this very graceful swipe of the glaive. And here she is signaling the end of the world. Now, at this point, Sailor Moon comes flying out of the abyss. Okay, everyone had assumed that she had died, and she comes flying out of the abyss to confront the forces of darkness. And Sailor Saturn is like, takes a moment and pauses. And Sailor Moon looks at Sailor Saturn. I mean, she recognizes that she's a sailor because she's dressed in the sailor outfit. Sailor Moon looks at Sailor Saturn, and she doesn't really know who she is. She's never met her before, but she recognizes that she's wearing a sailor suit. And immediately Uranus is like, kill her, you have to kill her. And Sailor Moon's like, why? What do I have to kill her? And Sailor Uranus says, she's the one who destroyed the Moon Kingdom. She's the one who pulled the plug on everything. And she's going to do that again. And once again, like before, Sailor Moon draws upon her heart, all right? And she looks at Sailor Saturn and she sees a little girl, a girl who's younger than she is, a girl who would be about Chibi Usa's age, all right? And she says to Sailor Saturn, I don't know what you're here to do. I don't know really what you represent, but I want you to know that you are welcome, that you are loved. And Sailor Uranus is going crazy because, well, as you can imagine, Uranus would be rather anxious in the presence of Sailor Saturn, with good reason. And Uranus is like, kill her, and Sailor Moon's like, no, I'm not going to kill her. Sailor Saturn, it's clear that you're coming from a place of pain and of hurt, and I want you to know that you are loved, that you are accepted by all of us, that you have a place here in the kingdom now. And Sailor Saturn pauses. Sailor Saturn hesitates before making that last final gesture that would mark the end of things. And instead, what Sailor Saturn does is Sailor Saturn looks at this dark entity. I think its name is Pharaoh 9 or something like that. It's unleashed entropy. And Sailor Saturn looks at this dark entity and sizes up the dark entity. And the dark entity is like, I'm dark and I'm going to swallow and eat everything. And Sailor Saturn instead takes her glaive and she goes right for the dark entity. And somehow she grabs almost the scruff of the neck of this huge, enormous dark entity. And Sailor Pluto opens up a gateway in time and space. And Sailor Saturn takes this dark entity and flies through this portal of time and space and disappears on the other side of the portal, and the portal is closed. So essentially, what we've just witnessed is that instead of bringing about the destruction of the Earth, Sailor Saturn, being moved by the pleas of Sailor Moon, does something that all the other sailors cannot do, because she's clearly the most powerful sailor of them all. And she takes it into another dimension where she will battle it for all eternity. The difference that begins to dawn on everyone, the difference between what had happened before and what's happening now, is that before, Princess Serenity had killed herself in despair over the loss of Prince Endymion. And now Sailor Moon has done the appeal that Princess Serenity wasn't able to do a millennia ago. Sailor Moon can now do it. And so by appealing to the darkness and the coldness of Saturn, which really masquerades a great deal of pain and rejection, Sailor Saturn makes, in true Saturnian form, the ultimate sacrifice and takes that dark being into another dimension where they will battle through the end of time. And we know it's the end of time because this is Saturn, and Saturn is the planet of time. And in that moment that Saturn disappears into the portal, Sailor Moon is transformed into Neo Queen Serenity, and Queen Serenity says, with every ending, there comes a new beginning of hope and rebirth. What's so brilliant about Takeuchi's familiarity with astrology is that she knows that the moon rules Cancer and Saturn rules Capricorn, and so that they sit opposite one another on the zodiacal wheel. That Cancer is associated to the season of summer and abundance, and that Saturn is associated to the season of winter, which is darkness and scarcity. Saturn in astrology represents the end of things, and the moon in astrology represents the reappearance of the moon after having disappeared into the darkness of the balsamic moon. We have the balsamic moon, which is the last phase of the moon. We have darkness, and then we have a sliver of light that reappears, signaling the beginning of a new lunation cycle. And having paired these two in this moment that ends this story, we have the finality of an end, and then we have the beginning of a new cycle, the beginning of something new. What's really going to go on to become the beginning of the Neo Silver Millennium. And so Neo Queen Serenity appears out of the metamorphosis of Sailor Moon, and she holds up the scepter of light, which shines all over what was the darkened earth. And they call out Neo Queen Serenity. And Queen Serenity's answer is the light is always there, leading us, guiding us like a brilliant Messiah. And of course, standing atop this column, Neo Queen Serenity brings about all the restoration of the moon. The moon was always associated with restoration. When you went to sleep, you wake up in the morning feeling replenished and restored. The moon was always associated with new growth. Saturn was the clearing away of the dead wood, and the moon was the beginning of the new growth, which is why the moon follows Saturn in this progression. So Neo Queen Serenity's powers are the miraculous power of restoration, the miraculous power of revival, and the miraculous power of renewal. I hope that you have enjoyed this fusion of East and Western astrology, and I hope that you remember that the moonlight is a messenger of love. If you enjoyed what you saw, please press the like button. It helps more than you know. If you could subscribe, that would be wonderful. I've had such a wonderful time visiting with you this week, and I can't wait to get together next time on Christopher Renstrom Astrology.